Welcome back to Lesson 10 in Make It Meaningful Transition Assessment for Students Who are Deaf and Lower Functioning, sponsored by the Texas Education Agency, Northern Illinois, and my name is Professor Greg Long. In this, Lesson 10, we're going to do a summary of the previous 9 lessons. If you haven't watched the 9 lessons, would encourage you to do so. They're structured in a way that most of them are 10 to 15 minutes long at most. I think you might find them helpful. On the other hand, if this is what you're watching, then I certainly want you to take some benefit from this. Now, as we went through our lessons, the first thing we started talking about had to do with terminology and how we define this group and how diverse they were. So when we talked about terminology, I mentioned that, yes, throughout the video, we've talked about these students as low-functioning deaf. I struggle with that a bit because, they're students first and they're individuals first. And so referring to them as low-functioning deaf is rather pejorative and puts a lot of burden on them. I prefer using more person-first language, but that is something that is open to debate for people. When we think of terminology, we also see not only is the term low-functioning deaf used, but we've seen many other terms used: lower achieving, traditionally underserved, minimal language skilled. All these focus on the same idea here. And when we talk about the rationale for low functioning, the idea being with that is that you're having challenges, particularly related to communication, across all aspects of life, because communication is so very pervasive throughout what we do. So we use low functioning because it's well known. Historically, it's been out there for years and years. And so while I may not necessarily like the term, we're using it here because it does provide continuity and people know what we're talking about. Because if I said, hey, the traditionally underserved deaf, you wouldn't know. If I say low functioning deaf, we're clear on our group, because as we've defined them before, the one thing that's most important for these students as we look at them and as they make a transition into adulthood, what we know is that communication deficits are pervasive. So that if there's no other bit of information, we need to know what's their communication. And this has been endorsed by not only a number of other authors and theorists who've talked about this. There was an Institute on Rehabilitation Issues that had a document published in 2000. There's been Commission on Education of the Deaf that was published in the late 80s. People have talked about this, but a study done by Northern Illinois University Research and Training Center on traditionally underserved persons who are deaf, what we did is we sent out surveys to well over 1,000 educators and rehabilitation professionals, and based on the 700 responses we got, which included 350 from deaf educators, what we found is that across the board, as people think of this group of individuals, that communication deficits are the hallmark characteristic. And that if communication deficits exist, then they're going to affect your socialization, your ability to live independently, to understand healthcare and sexuality and so forth. So the communication deficits really are central in terms of understanding who we're talking about. Another aspect we mentioned in Lesson 1 had to do with the great diversity within this population. And as we think about it from a testing standpoint or an assessment standpoint, this diversity, while yes, it's accurate to the population, it does cause us some challenges from an assessment standpoint because, how did the person become deaf? Is it hereditary? Okay, well, that's maybe 10% of the population, but for many others, it could be due to trauma, some unknown etiology, oftentimes associated with additional disabilities. So, cause and the presence of additional disabilities create a more challenging issue as far as testing goes. Socioeconomic issues differ. Those people who are more well-to-do have access to better schools, better healthcare, better nutrition. All those things are associated with better success in life. If you're poor, it's a much bigger challenge. And then another part of diversity as we look at this has to do with, and what do you have available to you in terms of services? If you live in a major metropolitan area, generally you can find things. If you're in a more rural setting, less so. And I can even say living within or living near a major metropolitan area. I live near Chicago. When I had my brother come and join me about 12 years ago at this point, it took me a solid 2 years with all my background and training to find an appropriate placement for him. So even when you have family support, finding the supports or implementing plans and interventions isn't always as easy as we might like. One of the things we also mentioned, and this is an important thing to keep in mind, has to do with experiential deficits. You can make this argument as it relates to any individual who's deaf, in that if it's not seen visually, you're going to miss out on it. If you are deaf and lower functioning, you're going to interpret the world from what you see, but your language skills are such that it's going to make it difficult to understand. And so that ability to access and process incidental learning is much more limited among this population. So, and if you have limitations in experience, then it's going to obviously be related to communication, but it's going to have an impact on safety because, safety and opportunity. Do we let this person go out and about? Are they safe crossing the street? Are they safe going and buying things? How can we provide opportunities for them? And for many people, and it's a reasonable thing. I'm truly not saying parents are being overprotective, because being a parent of a young adult who has a disability and being my brother's guardian, I can say I've oftentimes had to be very concerned with safety and opportunities to both provide opportunities for my brother David as well as for my stepson as he enters adulthood. In our second lesson, if you would, we talked about some traditional assessment approaches and made a distinction about talking about standardized testing. And that while that's very common, I suspect the vast majority of you who are watching this video are familiar with standardized testing. And, it's got a diagnostic focus on it most typically. It's very useful because it provides information on, numbers, so it quantifies things. We know that it's been administered in a standardized fashion. So there are a number of aspects of standardized testing that are all well and good, except that when we take standardized testing and we apply it to use with students who are deaf, it's problematic. As we talked about before, how do you administer it? If I'm giving a test and there are verbal directions, if I'm saying, define what does the word upset mean, okay? If I fingerspell it versus signing it, are those the same thing? Do they mean the same thing? So upset versus upset. Which is, how does that make a difference? How do we score that? How does that fit into administration? Norm groups we've talked about from the idea of, given this great diversity that exists among the population, with any one individual, who do you compare them with? Do you compare them only with other people who are deaf? And even that, there are very few tests that have just deaf norms. But then the further you get away from the profile of, typically white, male, middle class, so on and so forth, you get away from the profile. Now, to what extent do we feel comfortable making judgments? Talked a bit about lots of examiners are out there and very few have background knowledge or experience. And, even when you have background knowledge and experience, you may have to use an interpreter. And if you use an interpreter, how does that work? Not only in terms of like the physical, where they sit, how are they paid, how are they arranged, but what's the impact on the testing if you're using an interpreter versus speaking it or signing for yourself? In lesson 3, we talked about transition, and we talked about that from the standpoint of, for all of us who move from adolescence to adulthood, there are a number of tasks that we need to accomplish. Those tasks include not only employment, community living, social skills, the normal things that we would expect as we make change from being an adolescent to a young adult. Now, to have that happen for the students that we're interested in, typically we're going to have some transition planning take place, that it's not going to happen on its own. So if we're talking about that, then from a transition planning standpoint, getting everyone involved, having a discussion about what needs to happen, who's going to take responsibility, gaining the students' input, those are all parts of looking at this with students who are deaf and low functioning. In lesson 4, we talked about, it was kind of an assessment refresher, given that a lot of people who are watching this perhaps may not have much background in testing. And so started off with the idea that we need to have a planning focus. If we're talking about transition assessment for deaf adults or deaf adolescents moving through transition to adulthood, think about futures orientation, planning orientation. And honestly, standardized tests aren't typically helpful for this. They're helpful for diagnosis and classification, but not necessarily for planning. And so from a planning standpoint, what we emphasized in that lesson was the idea of using an ecologically based functional assessment. And in this process, very quickly, we identify what the behavior is of concern, and it could be communication, it could be an inappropriate behavior in the classroom. There's any number of things, but we look at the behavior, we look at what the skills the person has to go along with this. We describe the environment in which this behavior needs to occur. We see, all right, are there discrepancies between what a person needs to be able to do and what they've got? And then from that, where there are discrepancies, we plan, implement, and put forth interventions based upon those tasks that are seen as very important but not possessed. So where we see discrepancies, we plan our interventions to address those. We also talked a bit about assessment reports and the kinds of things that they should include. One of the things that is important to keep in mind here is, as with any testing, the referral question guides how you do evaluation. So if it's a referral question, we're really looking at diagnosis, then use a standardized test. But if we're looking for transition planning, we're looking for how to move to what's next in life after high school, then standardized testing isn't going to be our choice. So your referral question drives the assessment. It's what tells us what to do. In that lesson, we talked about the components of what you would typically see in a report. The two things that I mentioned that were particularly notable and that would be an expectation for a well-written report on a student who is deaf and lower functioning has to do with within the background information. You have to mention the deafness. You have to provide some information in terms of cause, severity, age of onset, so on and so forth. Those things are very helpful. Those provide some background that we need to know. And the other part in a report that we would typically expect would be in the behavioral observation section, that there should in fact be some discussion there about how communication was accomplished during the session. So was an interpreter used? Did the evaluator sign for himself or herself? How was communication? And was it, do we think that the student understood? So from my standpoint, as we look at assessment reports, those two things, the background information and behavioral observations, are really quite critical and should be part of any assessment report, whether it's a formal report that's more standardized or a more informal report like we're talking about with functional assessment. Talked a bit about implementation of accommodations, and that relates to what do you have available as far as resources and opportunity. Bigger cities, more money, so on and so forth, greater opportunities. Rural locations, less money, fewer opportunities and resources. Talk about accommodations in terms of how well people are willing to do them, their willingness, the availability of them. And then when we talk about assessment and transition, we also not only deal with accommodations, but the idea of natural supports, the idea here where we're looking at what are the friends, family, coworkers, and so forth that can be used to help make a successful transition and successful experience wherever we're looking. So in closing, I would like to thank you very, very much for watching these sets of lessons with me. I hope that you find them valuable. Again, my name is Greg Long. I'm a professor at Northern Illinois University, and for the immediate future, it's currently 2015. For the next, hopefully, 5 or 10 years, I should be reachable at glong, Glong, at niu.edu. Thank you very much, and I hope you found this valuable.